So today we're going to talk about faith and its relationship to sin. Now, you rarely ever hear a sermon, if you've ever heard a sermon on this in particular. But faith and sin are related as opponents. We're going to see that in one of the stories in the gospel. They're not stories, they're actual events that are being related to us. So we're going to see it in an event in the Gospels. It actually occurs only in one of the Gospels, but three of them talk about the surrounding event, but only one of them has the very particular one that we're going to look at. We're going to look at all three, because one of the other two actually mentions something about the disciples that information is not in the other two. So we got to look at all three of these in order to understand fully what's going on. And you say, well, what is that? We'll get to it, don't worry. First, what I want you to do is I want you to open your translations of the Bible to Romans chapter 14. And I want you to look starting in verse 22. Now, Paul is addressing this very particular issue about eating and drinking. And if you go to verse 21, it says, it is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak. 22. Hast thou faith, persuasion, keep that in mind. The word is persuasion, not our modern day magic-oriented faith. It's persuasion. Hast thou the persuasion of faith? We can say that. That's even better. Have it to thyself before God. Hold it to thyself before God. That's the verb is hold. Hold it to thyself before God. Happy is he that condemneth not himself in that thing which he alloweth. In other words, your faith may allow you to do something, but you still may be condemned because you're doing it and causing a brother to stumble. Don't go around broadcasting it either. Oh, well, we have the liberty in Christ to do this. And you know that the brother his conscience is injured by that statement. And he may go in, you might say, well, we have the liberty to drink wine. And so then he goes in and starts drinking, becomes an alcoholic, his marriage is destroyed, his family's split apart, and he's homeless on the street, dies in a gutter. And you know whose fault it is? Take a guess. You're condemned by that. That's what Paul is saying. Verse 23. And he that doubteth is damned. The one who alloweth is damned if he causes a brother to stumble. And he that doubteth is damned if he eat because he eateth not of faith. So the one that you cause to stumble also is damned, because he ate not from faith, but from doubt, but he ate because of you. For whatsoever is not of faith is sin. Hear it again. Whatever is not of faith is sin. Whatever is not from persuasion is sin. Okay? Very important. So now keep that in mind. Whatsoever is not of faith is sin. Keep that. You should memorize that and memorize where it is. Romans 14:23. Whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So now let's go ahead and read those three stories, or events, rather. Okay? So let's see here. The first one is we're going to read in John 6. John 6. And one moment. All right. Yeah, there it is. All right, good. So in John 6, we just had them feed the people. And there are two of these, so I'm trying to find out how many were at this one. Anyway, it was one of the times where they fed the people with the bread and the fish. Okay? 5,000. This is the 5,000. So he feeds the 5,000 with the bread and the fish. And and at the end, it's very interesting. It says, after they gathered it up and they saw how much was left over, then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. So he perceived that these men that he just fed, reasoning from the Bible, had it in their hearts to force him, physically force him to become their king. And he ran away. How many of us would be willing to run away from the crowds of Christians who look favorably on us and want to turn us into something that we're not here to be? Many times, I'm not joking, many times I've had men, an individual man, come to me and ask to be my disciple. No kidding. Both Americans and foreigners who have come and asked to be my disciple. They literally asked that. They asked if they could be my disciple. I thought that's a strange thing to ask. I've never even thought about asking someone to become their disciple. For me, it doesn't even cross my mind. They're disciple. But when you think of disciple, it means learner, that they're going to learn from you. Well, okay, all right. So we would say that I would be their mentor then. So if you put it in modern parlance, then it would be that I'm their mentor and they're the mentee. Not like mint tea, but mentee, like mentor, mentee. And so when you put it in that sense, okay, all right, fine. Mentor, mentee, maybe. But I don't like doing that. I'm not here for that. I'm not here to disciple people. I'm here to be a teacher in the church. And that's what I'm doing. And if I ever had people, well, I had one guy. Yeah, there was one guy who was about 15 years older than me, maybe even older. Almost my dad's age, 20 years older. And he was really impressed with what I was showing him in Scripture. He was a Christian for a long time. And he said, oh, he wasn't the one who was for a long time. This is a different one. This guy wasn't for a long time, maybe about 7 years, I guess. And he asked me, he says, are you starting a new Reformation? He was so excited. I said, no, I'm not here for that. He says, are you starting your own church? He didn't have a church. I said, nope, I'm not here for that. I'm here to speak the truth. I'm here to correct the abuses of the Protestant churches. I'm here to rebuke those who follow Darby, Calvin, Luther, and all of those men and do not follow Jesus. And that's what Jesus did here. When the men wanted to make him into a king, force him to become a king. He went away alone into the mountain. All right, but this isn't the passage that I want to focus on, but you need to know the context of what comes next. Verse 16, and when evening was now come, his disciples went down unto the sea, and entered into a ship, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. I'm going to read it in here, all right, because it's going to be easier to understand. We're in John 6, and we are on around 16. Now when the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Interesting, huh? Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Okay? So, and that's it. That's what it was. They were afraid when they saw Jesus. Jesus got in the boat, and the boat was suddenly, immediately there at the land. That was a miracle also, in addition to him walking on the water. So now let's have a look at the other one about walking on the water, which is Mark 6. That was John 6. This is Mark 6. It's not in Luke. Luke doesn't have this event. Mark 6, and it has also the fish just before it. And it just says how many there were. There were about 5,000 who had eaten it. And that was it. It doesn't talk about trying to force him to make him king. So it's important to know that. So now here we go in verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. He wasn't headed to the boat. He wasn't headed to the boat. Notice that. He would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and cried out, like let out a loud yelp. For they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and marveled. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. The disciples' heart were hardened. They had hard hearts, the disciples. Even when Jesus was performing the miracle of the loaves and the fish with the 5,000, feeding them, their hearts were hardened. And so when it came time in the evening when Jesus was walking on the water and was just about to pass them, and they saw him, they shrieked. And they marveled at it because their hearts had been hardened when he conducted the miracle of the loaves and the fish. That's why they marveled at him walking on the water, because they hadn't understood the loaves and the fish, that it was a miracle. They looked at it as an accident. That's what a hard heart does. It tries to explain away rather than identifying God's work in something. It dismisses it. explains it away. That's a hard heart. All right, so let's go ahead to the last one, which is the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel according to Matthew, kata, according to Matthew, chapter 14. And this is the one where Peter also walks on the water. And also has the feeding of the multitudes beforehand. And it doesn't mention them trying to seize him to force him to become king. So that was only in John's. And there's 5,000 men besides women and children. So it was much more than 5,000. Immediately, verse 22, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary, was against them. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." Now it doesn't say that he would have passed them by, but we know that from the other one. And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." Exactly the same words. And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. That's faith. At that moment, he had put sin aside. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. He started to sin. Because he was suddenly doubting. Whatever's not done in faith is sin. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." His sin started to cause him to go down in. But his faith cried out to Jesus that Jesus could save him. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, what does he say? "O you of little faith." Why did you doubt? Whatever is not done in faith is sin. Paul said that. He declared that as a principle. This means what caused Peter to sink was not about the troubles and worries of life. Those also, if you are doubting Jesus and ultimately doubting the Father's providence, you are sinning. Because you don't have faith in his providence, that he provides for you. You're sinking. Peter saw the threat, the physical threat, and suddenly stopped doing this in faith, and it showed because he started sinking in the water. He had a physical response to him doubting and losing faith. There was a physical reaction. He was being plunged under the very dangerous waters that he was threatened by. When you're going through your daily life and you're terrified of something, if you start doubting God that he is giving you that power to walk on the water, when you start fearing that thing, you start doubting. And you're going to be engulfed by the very thing that you are fearful of. But if you find yourself being engulfed by it, cry out, "Help me, Jesus," and hold your hand up for him to grab your hand more easily. And he will pull you out before you drown. This is the story. This is the events, not just a story, the events that happened. This related in the Gospels, according to John, according to Mark, according to Matthew, of Jesus walking on the water. Jesus had no doubt. Jesus had complete faith. That's why he could walk on the water. He wasn't threatened by anything. He could command the winds and the waves to be still. We saw that already at the beginning of Mark when we talked about Mark 4 and 5. Peter had faith at the beginning. He started walking on the water. He said, "If that's you, Lord, command me to come to you." He said, "Come." One word, "Come." And Peter, from that one word, had faith to walk on the water. And he stepped down out of the boat and started walking on the water. But when something distracted him off of the Lord from having persuasion in Jesus, that thing that was threatening him, that was distracting him and making him fearful, is the very thing that caused him to plunge down into the sea. But his faith wasn't gone, because he used that faith that he had left to say, "Jesus, help me." And that last strength he had while he's being plunged under, to hold his hand up, to receive the help. If you don't hold your hand up, then it doesn't make it so easy for the Lord to pull you out of the stormy sea that you're being plunged into. Hold your hand up for Jesus to more easily grab it. May the Lord bless you as you seek him with all your heart.